Okay, good morning everyone. My name is Asanga Udugama. I come from Bremen, the University of Bremen. Thanks Laura so my talk is about swim. Considering the weather, of course, I'm not talking about taking a swim, but unfortunately, but it's about this mobility model that we looked into. So my talk, first, why we looked at it, then the model itself, a little bit details about it, what we learned about OMNeT along the way when we wanted to implement this model, and then how we implemented a little bit infos about implementation, and then a very small evaluation and summary and future work. So the motivation. The Internet of Things is expected to grow into billions of devices. So to cater to this, we at our working group, we are looking at different communication architectures, and one of them relates to opportunistic networking. Now, when you look at all these IoT scenarios, many of them relates to human-oriented scenarios. Like, for example, a smartphone user who has enabled, health monitoring. Well, as soon as you bring in the human factor, there is always mobility. Of course, when you look at the IoTs, they're huge. So, simulating is the best way forward. So, our choice has been OMNeT. So, we've used OMNeT in a lot of our work. So, when you look at OMNeT, there are a lot of mobility models that are there. But we found that when you consider human mobility, there are certain characteristics that were not being addressed in those models. And there was this work done, not by us, by some other researchers from a university in Italy, where they built this model called Small Worlds in Motion, which addresses these characteristics related to human mobility. So the work that we have done, what we want to present here, is that we have implemented this model in OMNeT, and as always our policy has been, we benefit a lot from OMNeT, so we want to also contribute back to the community, and we want to make this public. So that's the purpose of this talk. So what is SWIM, Small Worlds in Motion, the mobility model? So the authors of this model identify two intuitions of human mobility. The first of them is that they say that most of the people will visit regularly locations close to their neighborhood. And if they ever visit a further away location, that is because of popularity. So this is the sort of fundamental background of this mobility model. So based on this, they categorize a set of locations as home or neighboring locations and a set of visiting locations. And each location is assigned a weight. Okay, I will not go into the details of the mathematics behind, but generally the distance is based on power law. That means the further away the distance is to a certain location from the home location of the user, the lower the value is. And then on the other side of the equation, you have what is called scene, which is basically the popularity of that location in terms of how many people were there. And then they also use a constant called the alpha to sort of decide like what would be the emphasis. So as I said, so this weight function basically increases the value if a place is popular and decreases the value if it is further away from the home location. And the proposers of this mobility model have empirically evaluated this with real tracers to identify, to validate the model. So when we looked at the stuff around and the different human-related mobility models, and this was one of the models that attracted us because it was empirically evaluated not only by them, of course, but a student project that we had separately. The student used some data that he collected from his own and from other students to also empirically evaluate. So that was the attraction that the model had for us. So what we did was we wanted to implement this. So of course, to implement in OMNeT, you need to know about how things have to be done. So this is just a brief sort of a few statements about what we learned along the way. So in OMNeT, there are a number of models. All are available in the INET, mobility models, I mean. All are available in the INET framework. When you look at the different classifications, there are, synthetic models which have mobility patterns generated artificially, and then there is the alternative of the tracers, which are patterns which are based on actual movements. Synthetic models are further classified into deterministic models, which is sort of devoid of any stochasticity, and random models, where a lot of the patterns, the variables, different variables are based on randomness is present. And the SWIM model is of course a synthetic model, of course empirically validated, but the model is based on a couple of mathematical formulations, and it has a random destination selection based on the weights. So when you look at INET, we see that there is if you want to, it's very nicely written. I must accept that it was very easy for us to do our job. There is an interface called iMobility. So you just implement this and then you have your mobility model. There are a lot of methods that have to be implemented, a couple of methods that have to be implemented, and then all the other models that require information from the mobility model can immediately get them out through this interface. Not only that, OMNeT also has a set of base implementations which extend the iMobility and also implement some of this stuff which are sort of very straightforward based on different categorizations. So for example, there is a base implementation called linear segments mobility base, which is basically moving a node in a linear manner in segments. So it's really easy. I mean, implementing a mobility model, this is what we learned along the way. So is really easy to something that you could do. Well, in the case of SWIM, we use the linear segments mobility base to extend the functionality. So what did we do? So basically, in the case of SWIM says that we need to have a constant speed and a linear movements. And so the linear segments mobility base was really ideal. And then we implemented, like we separated the work into two parts. The initialization phase, like a one-time job, and then you have the mobility phase where things have to be done over and over. So this is what we did in the model itself, just a flowchart, but I will just explain. So in this part of the model, we simply create the different locations, because swim requires us to create these different locations and identify what are the neighbors, who are the neighbors of a certain location, and who are the sort of visiting locations. So that sort of identification has to be done at the initialization, because that's a one-time job, because that is based on the initial position of the mobile node. And then in the iterative part, the continuous part, we have to, of course, decide what next destination to take when it goes to when it goes to the end of a phase of movement. And then, more importantly, the swim mobility model requires that you keep a track of how many nodes that you saw at any given location. So this is a continuous process, because the mobile node moves, and then when it moves to a certain place, it has to know, like, okay, these were the nodes that I saw, so this is how popular that's how the mobility model works. So this is how popular it is. So these are some of the variables that we used to configure. Okay, I mean, not very important. For example, the first one is neighboring location limit, because you need to know, like, within a radius, who are your neighbors or neighboring locations, and who are your visiting locations, like the further, and so on. So this is basically all the values, and also the alpha. The alpha is the one that sort of is the tuning parameter that sort of indicates where do you put where do you place the emphasis. So the evaluation. So it was like we did not want to extensively evaluate, because, we did some with the student when the student evaluated this, but our intention was to see that the mobility model works in the way that we have that we want it to work. So here you could see two graphs of how we have sort of the slider of the alpha has been moved back and forward. So here you see, when you have a lower alpha, what happens is that you put more emphasis on the popularity of the place rather than the distance. So you would see in this one, I hope you see that a lot of these lines really come to visiting or further locations, you see here. And when you increase the alpha, then you see that you put more emphasis to your neighboring locations. When I say emphasis, what I mean is that there is more likeliness of selecting a neighboring location in this than selecting a further location. So basically this is how we sort of tune this parameter. So it's a sort of a struggle, so to speak, to know exactly what this value of alpha is. But it's you know, depending on certain scenarios, you could figure this out. So to summarize, we found this model which was empirically validated, a mathematical model, which is meant for human mobility. It is based on, two fundamental intuitions of human mobility. That means like regularly visited places are usually in your neighborhood, and if you visit a further location, then that is because of its popularity. And the purpose of this work, what I presented, is to just inform the community that we have implemented this model, and currently it is in GitHub. So if you want to have use it, you can simply use it. And in the future, we would like to talk with the core guys to see how we could sort of push it into the OMNeT framework, because this is one of the models that we think is really suitable for human mobility, because a lot of the scenarios that we looked into like had human element in it. So that was the reason why we brought this model into our work. So the future work. So this is, the reason for implementing SWIM was because of opportunistic networks, because we work on those. We have a model that we have already built called the organic data dissemination, and some of the scenarios we have a partner from South America who has some scenarios related to human mobility. So we want to apply that there in this context, and then we figured out the model that is there is maybe the models that are there in OMNeT maybe is not suitable. So we went ahead and implemented. So that was the purpose of this work. But as you know, like for some of the scenarios it works well. But we found that there are some aspects that still have to be addressed in SWIM itself. And the main factor, based on our scenarios, is that SWIM is not sufficiently reactive enough, or not sufficiently, no reactiveness at all. Because once you decide, like a path, you just stick to it, and then you go to the other destination. But some of these scenarios that we want to look into relate to scenarios where, while the node is mobile, it has to change course, in the sense that, and this change of course is not just, saying you go this way, you go that way, and so on. It also relates to how what we called as the human behavior modeling. Like, because for example, take this example for as an example. So the most basic example, there are other examples, like let's say there is somebody is traveling to a concert. Let's say, we always take, let's say we go to Hamburg. But along the way, there is some information that comes from Hamburg that says, hey, there is something that is there is an emergency there, so you just cannot go there anymore. So you need to sort of change your plans, right? So this kind of behavior is not part of SWIM. So that is something that we also want to sort of model, and we have not so many solutions as such at the moment, but we are looking into some mathematical formulations of also including the reactiveness into SWIM. So these are the references that some of the references. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you. Yeah.
One question that, so this mobility model is an abstraction. Like, what is its relation to reality? So when you say near places and visited places, like what should I have in mind? Like the nearby shop or the neighboring city? Is it like a walking or driving or public transport?
Okay, so
people sometimes walk, sometimes drive.
Yes. Yeah. So the idea was that, like, if you take usual human beings like daily routine, you will go to a shopping mall nearby, you will go to a supermarket nearby, you will go to work which is nearby. So these are sort of the neighboring locations. But let's say you go somewhere, like for example, I mean, for us, let's say you go to Berlin to see something, right? That's a visiting location, but you don't go very often. For example, we go to like a concert in Hamburg, because we are from Bremen.
Does the model account for different speeds, like walking speed or driving speed and flight?
It could also, at the moment they say, we could also use differing velocities for these models, but at the moment it says, constant speed, and at least the scenarios that we look into are human, walking speeds. That's what we look at.
What place or the schools are considered as a neighborhood or the destination?
So neighborhood are the places that you regularly visit.
So, for example, if I'm a student, because I regularly go to a university,
Yes.
sometimes when I'm taking a train or bus,
Yes.
considered as a neighborhood or destination according to your framework?
It depends on how you look at it, but I would say in this context, it is a neighboring location, because regularly, yeah, it's that you visit this place regularly. So that's how this, they look at this model. In this model, that usually, so that's why you also have the radius to decide, like what are your neighboring locations and what are your further locations or visiting that's how the classification is done. What are the visiting locations?
But according to your explanation, this job or the school far from your residence is very hardly fit into either neighbor or destination, because it's regular visit, but it's very far from your typical your neighborhood, like a supermarket or bar or whatever, right? So you just put it is based on the radius. So
Yes.
based on the radius, it can be considered as a neighbor.
Yes.
Maybe beyond that radius, be considered as a destination.
Yes, as a sort of popular place that you would.
Popular place, but
Okay.
regular looking place.
It depends on what you set for your radius to decide, like what, because it depends on what you would consider as being your neighboring locations and what you would consider as being outside this neighboring location.
Think about it. Maybe some people are living here in Brno
Mm-hmm.
and then commuting to maybe 1 hour driving to another nearby city.
Yes.
But they also some visit to maybe concert hall or some city center. It's not neighborhood, but destination. So in such a case, destination is maybe nearer than this.
I mean, of course, you would have outliers. I mean, I'm not telling you, I don't sort of go beyond. I mean,
Extremely long commutes are not included.
no, I mean, of course, you could justify in many different ways, but but the general, for example, if you consider in Bremen the student population, like they sort of have the university to come to. Okay, and they take a tram like maximum maybe 45 minutes maximum, and then they go to a shopping mall, a supermarket, And also for people, like usually people generally, I mean, of course you cannot cover everything, that I accept. I mean, you just took an outline.
The final comment is my first impression when you explained this.
Okay.
Is that, okay, this is model is good for
Uh-huh.
retired person or homemaker
Uh-huh.
without having regular job.
Yeah, okay. I mean, that could also, but generally, yeah, you see that people sort of tend to have this sort of pattern, right? Yeah, I mean, okay, there are also, exceptions, as you said, but generally that's the case.
So I think we need to take the rest of the discussion offline. This is a mobility model for people with short commutes. People who live near the work.
Okay,
I think we need to thank the speaker and move on to the next one.
thank you. Yeah, maybe can you just.